Hi, this is Justin Davidson. I'm the architecture critic at New York Magazine and Curbed, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. With so many good architecture books coming out, we can barely keep up scheduling interviews, but we're going to try. Joining the show today are authors Darren Betsky and Sam Lubell, architecture photographer Darren Bradley, and Danish Modern furniture savant Carl de Silva. And now, your host and part-time savant, Mr. Modernism George Smart.
Hey, thanks, Tom. Indeed, I am called an idiot savant, mostly by my lovely wife, and mostly for the idiot part. I'm a husband, and that's just part of my job description. I do important stuff like remembering birthdays and anniversaries, planning regular romantic dates, and generally meeting all the home maintenance requests. But I do also eat the last item without putting it on the grocery list, forget to turn the light off in the bathroom, or lose my keys for the 400th time. There are moments of savantness, however. When I'm at a party, someone always comes up to share about their childhood modernist house in North Carolina. There are about 5,000 here. We're the number 3 state after California and Florida.
Wow.
Did you know that?
No.
Most people don't.
I grew up in one, but gee.
Without giving any details, these folks describe the house and the vibe and how wonderful it was to grow up there. And they are so sad if the house has been since torn down. And sometimes they get pretty emotional because modernist houses evoke strong feelings. After a few minutes, I'll ask, "Do you mean the X house on Y Street?" And they go, "How did you know that?" Unfortunately, researching all these houses has burned vast amounts of useless information in my brain. Fortunately, knowing this stuff and sharing it with people at parties and other places is one of the great joys of my life.
See, it's not completely useless.
One of these conversations almost got me a new sister, but that's a story for another day. And to my wife's dismay, all this architecture genius has not improved my ability to put dishes in the dishwasher in a timely manner. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs.
Like Judy Blunt, Dana Carvey, Jesse Tyler Ferguson, David Lynch, and a totally jacked J.K. Simmons, returning podcast guest Darren Betsky was born in Missoula, Montana. A Yale graduate,
Go Bulldogs!
Darren is a long-respected leading voice in art, architecture, and design as a lecturer, curator, and author. He's held significant roles at the Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture, Virginia Tech School of Architecture, the Netherlands Architecture Institute, and the Cincinnati Art Museum. His latest book is called Don't Build, Rebuild: The Case for Imaginative Reuse in Architecture. Here's George's conversation with Darren Betsky.
Darren, before we talk about your book, catch me up on what you've heard about the old Frank Lloyd Wright School of Architecture that you were dean at for a while. Is that place still going? Is it reconstituted somewhere? I know it was at Arco Santi for a little while. What's going on?
The School of Architecture, as it has been forced to call itself now, is located at a site called Cattle Track, which is a complex of studios in Scottsdale, Arizona. I'd say about 5 or 6 miles from Taliesin West, where it was originally based. And it is under the leadership of Chris Lash, who was the dean when I was the president. And he is working to continue the traditions that Frank Lloyd Wright started back in the 1930s.
So why isn't it the Frank Lloyd Wright School anymore?
Because the Frank Lloyd Wright Foundation claims copyright to all use of the name Frank Lloyd Wright and Taliesin. And as it has kicked the school out of the campus, off of the campus, it has taken away its right to use that name.
Okay. So maybe it needs a new patron, right? Like the Tom Main School of Architecture.
Maybe. I think maybe it just needs to go back to where it belongs, which is at Taliesin and Taliesin West.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for all your years of service there, because you were very instrumental in its success.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes, and I do hope that it will be able to come back and be where it belongs. It was a great institution, is a great institution, and we managed to do some really wonderful things with it. The students that were there during the period when I was dean and then president have gone on to do some fantastic stuff all across the world. And I certainly do hope that it will be able to have the long life it deserves.
Your new book is Don't Build, Rebuild: The Case for Imaginative Reuse in Architecture. And of course, reuse isn't a new idea, but there are a lot of new ways to do it. What are some of those?
Yes, thank you. I call it imaginative reuse. And what the book tries to make clear is that we need to stop making new buildings. First of all, for the simple reason that we cannot afford to use up natural resources that we mine from the ground or plant in factory forests and transport from far away to make new buildings. And we also have to stop taking away open space from our society. And instead, we should reuse all of the existing buildings that we have, but we should reuse them in a way that those structures, which were commissioned by people who had the money and power to have them built, are now open to a larger segment of our population, to our very diverse population. And we also need to renovate them in such a way so that the inherent beauty of these buildings comes out. The argument I try to make in Don't Build, Rebuild is that our buildings, if you open them up, slice into them, but also preserve them in a way that allows the many layers of history and the many stories that are contained in them to become visible, will allow you to feel at home in our complex world in much more natural ways, in ways that will bring us together and bring us together with our environment. So don't just build, but also don't just rebuild in such a way that you wipe out exactly what is great and beautiful about existing buildings. Don't plunk new stuff in the middle of old buildings, but find a way to rebuild that allows the character, the nature, the history, the narratives, the stories, the beauty of existing buildings to come out.
One of the examples that you give, one of the famous examples of this, is the High Line in New York City, which was a abandoned railroad line on the west side, not used for many, many years, that has just sat there and has become a very imaginative reuse. For people who have never been to New York, what's the High Line all about?
The High Line was a freight track that was a spur of the main railroad lines coming into New York that took goods all the way down to lower Manhattan. And yes, it sat abandoned for many decades and overgrown with weeds until a group of people, well, by now it's almost 20 years ago, started thinking about how they could reuse that site. And the team that finally did the renovation, Dilys Scofidio Renfro, the architects, James Corner, field operation, landscape architect, and the Dutch plant specialist and landscape architect Piet Oudolf, did it in such a way that, as I mentioned before, all those stories become available. So that freight line is now accessible, but it also still has in places the tracks so you can see them. Pete Aldolf brought back the original planting that would have been native to New York when white people got there, so you can understand the natural history of New York. And it also goes through existing buildings as the original freight line did, so that you experience those buildings from all sides. Those buildings have been opened up. And then the architects designed certain places where you get a completely different perspective on the city. So there's a spur of the spur, where they made the High Line into a kind of theater with steps that go down from the level of the High Line and let you look through a big window at the cars and people rushing by on the avenue below. So suddenly, what was just a city street has become an urban theater. And in the book, I talk about how it gets even better, or got even better, when Liz Diller, working with a few other people, did a performance on the High Line that lasted for a few nights. And during that performance, which was called the Mile Long Opera, you would walk up to the High Line and there would be 1,000 people singing along that line. And you would start right before dusk at the first person, and they would be singing a story of being in New York, of their interior, of the chest of drawers they had inherited or in another version had bought, of their loss, of the gentrification of the neighborhood. And as you would walk along, the story would develop. So each group of singers would take the story further, but not in some big narrative, but rather in glimpses of people's lives in the area around the High Line. At the same time, there would be performers inside some of the buildings that you can now see from the High Line that were further singing alive this story. And by the time you got to the end, you had this incredible view over Manhattan and over its new developments. And the singing became elegiac and really talked about loss and finding and bigger issues. And for me, it really showed how you can literally make a whole part of the city come alive through a combination of architecture, landscape architecture, strategic or tactical planning and performance. And all of those things can come together to really transform the city without spending a huge amount of money, or what's more important, without dedicating new resources we cannot replenish.
Now, I'm sure over the course of writing this book and before that, there were some buildings that you felt sure could be reused that got destroyed. What were some of those?
Good question. You know, buildings are being torn down continually, and you wonder why. I have to admit that I can't think of any specific building, but I do include in the book the work of an artist called Marion Teeuwens, who does a kind of last-ditch effort with buildings that are being torn down. And she goes to them while they're demolished, before they've been cleared out, and rearranges all the pieces to create a kind of alternate building out of the building that was once there. And it especially is poignant when she does it in Palestine with buildings that the Israelis have bulldozed. And she then photographs them, and what remains are those photographs as a memory of what was torn down. Well, I'll give you a good example. There's a 40-story high-rise in New York that was the headquarters of a major bank building, JP Morgan Chase. And rather than fixing it up, the company decided to tear the whole thing down with a tremendous waste of resources, of embodied carbon. And then with tons and tons of dump trucks, they hauled everything off and then hundreds of other trucks came in, brought in more concrete and steel and other material, and raised an 80-story building that has some more space, but not all that much more space, is not exactly more beautiful than the existing building, and has wasted a huge amount of resources. If this company had thought a little bit more sharply about how to reuse the building and find other opportunities to have their offices, I think that tremendous waste could have been avoided. And the beauty of a building, which was, by the way, designed by one of the few female architects we had in the middle of the 20th century, could have avoided having that and all of its beauty torn down.
Who was that architect?
Nathalie Dubois.
Oh, sure. Very well known now.
Yes.
Not so much when she was around, unfortunately.
No, everyone, all the men got the credit.
Right. As people start considering this decision of build versus rebuilding, what are the things that they're most ignorant about, that they just don't know in making that decision?
Well, an obvious thing is that there are a lot of tax credits available and you can get subsidies for reuse. But I think that people see the difficulties rather than the opportunities, as we often do. And it is true that in most cases, it unfortunately is still more expensive and certainly more complicated to reuse a building than to tear it down and rebuild it, because of modern codes and because of the way that the building industry is standardized around the mass production of these very wasteful building components. And so you have to work a little harder and you have to do a little bit more research, but there are resources around that can help you cut those things. The other thing that is important to realize is that even if you don't reuse a building, you can reuse so many components of existing buildings, but also from outside of the building trade. It's not just about restoration lumber. It's also, or Autolots Lumber, or those kind of companies. It's also about reusing all kinds of furnishings and pieces of other structures. There's an architect in the Netherlands who has produced something called the Harvest Map, which is a software that lets you map all the different components that you could possibly reuse in buildings. And this guy has found ways to reuse pieces of a subway system that was being rebuilt, windmills from those giant windmills that have to be replaced every number of years, washing machines, industrial sinks, all kinds of components that can be reused and bring their own kind of beauty with them. So opening yourself up to that possibility. And then when you reuse them, and this is important, also think about how they're going to be reused. So EU regulations are already making it so that in Europe, it's becoming more and more difficult to glue things in a building or to solder them or to somehow attach them in a way that makes it very difficult to reuse them. And we're realizing the beauty of old-fashioned screws and other kinds of fasteners that allow us to take things apart again and then put them together in another way or in another place. In the Netherlands, there was a new laboratory that had to be built. And so the architects realized that it was partially replacing another laboratory building just a stone's throw away. And so they reused part of the steel structure of that building. They reused some of its core. Then they found 18 toilets from a lawyer's office that was being renovated. They passed crews that were tearing down trees, getting rid of trees that were overaged next to a road, convinced them to let them use that wood. They found other pieces of stone in buildings that were being renovated and put the whole thing together out of all kinds of reused materials.
We've talked about the High Line. Are there any examples of reused buildings in New York that people can visit or at least walk by?
Oh, yeah, tons of them. I mean, New York actually is made up of lots of reused buildings. Some of them look exactly, largely, they were when they were built, like Grand Central Station. Others, like Apple stores, in which they've added all kinds of new things. But a great new example to go look at in New York would be the Powerhouse Art Center in Gowanus. The Powerhouse is located in what used to be the power station for the electrical trains in Queens and the lower part of Long Island. It had sat empty for many, many decades, and it had become a home of taggers and of ravers and of all kinds of artists squatting there. And now it is a very lively arts center with some labs built onto the back. And the architects of the renovation, Herzog de Meuron, preserved all of the tags and the marks of the life after it had as a power station, and those have now become part of its new reality.
So you're really telling a story across time.
Exactly. One of the ways I start this book is with 500 Cap Street, which was a project by the artist David Ireland from the early 70s. And David Ireland, like many artists, needed a place to live and work, could only afford a very simple working person's house in the Mission District of San Francisco. So he set about renovating it, but not just cleaning it up. But he started scraping away at the wallpaper, but leaving layers of wallpaper so all the stories were there. And he covered some of the other sort of distressed, well-worn walls with beeswax so that they shone and gained their own beauty. And when he found implements like brooms left over, he bundled them together and turned them into sculptures, reminding you of what went on there before. When he tried to take the safe down from upstairs and move it out, it hit the wall not once, but twice. So we put a little frame around where it made a mark on the wall, and that story became part of what you experience, what you see at 500 Cap Street.
The book is Don't Build, Rebuild, The Case for Imaginative Reuse in Architecture. Aaron, thanks for coming back on the show. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much, George. Very much enjoyed it, as always.
That was George chatting with author Darren Bradley. Sam Lubell, the former West Coast editor of the Architects newspaper, has a new book, The Atlas of Never-Built Architecture. One of Sam's cohorts is Darren Bradley, a renowned architectural photographer. In addition to their impressive books and photography, Sam and Darren have beautifully curated Instagram accounts showcasing modernist architecture. They've also produced 2 mid-century modern architecture travel guides, West Coast USA and East Coast USA.
Surprise, surprise.
Here's George's conversation with Sam Lubell and Darren Bradley via Zoom.
Darren and Sam, this is a great book. You guys have captured like the American Bandstand top 40 hits of modernism. I mean, all the great houses and buildings and structures are in here in one place. I don't think that's really been done before to this extent. So congratulations.
Thank you. It was, as always, a labor of love.
Darren, when did this project start? When did you start going out doing some of the photography for this?
It was about, I don't even remember, to be honest, over a year before the book saw publication, at least. Sam contacted me actually with a wish list of projects, many of which he already knew I had photographed previously because he was with me when I did a lot of them. So that was easy. But then there were a few on his wish list that he knew that I didn't have, and I had about 9 months or so to go out and try to find time to shoot them. Unfortunately, I didn't get to all of them, but there were other photographers involved and were brought in that either had photos that would meet the bill or were able to get access to these properties. But yeah, it was a while, and there was some back and forth with Sam and myself discussing what should be included or not, or whether I could get access to the various properties.
And Sam, there are about, 60 roughly buildings in this?
Yeah, maybe closer to 50. And the interesting thing about it is a greatest hits in some way of modernism, but it's really, I tried to take one piece of modernism, specifically in America,
And there'll be another book too to kind of round it out, believe it or not. But this book is a little bit more focused on projects that sort of swayed a little bit from the kind of traditional European modernism model that was coming to the States mostly from Europe, obviously from the likes of Mies and Gropius and all the names that people that listen to your podcast know well. And this is a little bit more focused on kind of strains of American modernism that kind of try to establish something new. And we have things like organic modernism. Obviously, Frank Lloyd Wright is kind of the father of that in America, although that's existed, even predated him. And you have some of the very sculptural projects and groovy projects like Saarinen and Pereira. You have kind of more expressionist stuff, even though, Art Deco, that's kind of got an American slant to it. So it's a little bit of an attempt to look at what is American modernism outside of kind of the European context, and what does that mean, and what does America and its relationship to architecture mean? Because it's a country that originally was a colony and sort of had to break free, but it took a while for it to kind of set its own precedent. A lot of the early stuff, even well into the 19th century, is kind of derivative of a lot of European architecture. And then only in the 20th century, when America really becomes a world power, does it really start to establish its own architecture. But that's definitely what we were trying to look at.
Well, as a practical matter, I would recommend anybody buy this book and just use it as a guide of what to go visit when you're in that town, because you just work your way through these buildings and you have seen the greatest hits. I'm going to read off a couple of them. Thorncrown Chapel in Arkansas, the Space Needle in Seattle, the Griffith Observatory in L.A., the Transamerica Pyramid in San Francisco, the Sheets Goldstein House, one of my very favorites, in Los Angeles, the Garcia House, also in Los Angeles, and then one that you guys stumped the band here, one I had never heard of before, and that was the Steele House by Robert Bruno. So let's talk about that one. That really surprised me to be on the radar. I had never seen it before.
Yeah, definitely Darren can weigh in here, but obviously with a book like this, you are trying to make a compilation, and you need to have some of the more well-known projects, and you need to have a dispersion of projects all across the country and different types of architects. And you also want to have a few surprises. And I definitely think that this one is is definitely a surprise. And you do see a lot of this kind of American, as I call it, American modernism. There's a level of sculpturalism in a lot of it. Obviously, you think of people like John Lautner,
Herb Green.
They're not shy. And the Steele House is obviously an example. It's basically a giant sculpture, as the name suggests, out of steel, pierced together from scrap panels. And it's very much like a scrappy sculptural, he's almost like a pioneering spirit in like a very modern form. And I think that's an element of American modernism when it sort of diverts into its own thing, that it wants to establish its own voice and say, look at me. But it's also scrappy. It's not as precious maybe as some of the models that it was looking after earlier in its architectural life as a country. So I love that house. I think it's great, and it's basically a sculpture that you can live in, and it's raw. I guess if you weighed the thing, it'd be like some gazillion tons of steel. It's really, I think of it as sort of like a pioneer house in modern form almost.
Darren, is that one of the houses you shot?
Unfortunately, no, I hadn't seen that one. I was aware of it, but I hadn't seen the photos of it until I saw the book, actually. But it was on the list of projects that Sam had asked me if I did have photos of, but I didn't get a chance to get out there to do it. What I would comment on is that, Sam and I have collaborated on a few projects together, including the modernism guidebooks on the East and West Coast. And putting together sort of the definitive list of what goes in a book is something that he and I had long debates about during long car drives across the country. And it's always a bit of a balance, because you obviously want to include sort of these iconic buildings by well-known architects that have to be in a book, or their absence would be too hard to justify. But at the same time, including some lesser-known projects, or what we were referring to as kind of vernacular architecture or vernacular modernism, which is a defining trait of American modernism, or any form of architecture really for that matter, which is to say, just coming up with these architects that aren't necessarily well known or even formally trained, that have just sort of taken what they've seen and been influenced by that to create their own view of it or their own version of it, unique to their own culture, education, environment. And we've always tried to make a point of including some of that in anything we do.
These architects of this genre are often referred to as the organic architects, which I kind of compare to architecture as monks are to priests. I mean, they are very intense and very serious about their work and very defensive of it. And they do create these real sculptures. You know, looking at the Steel House, one can admire it right away. But my question is, and I don't know if you know the answer to this or not, Sam, it's in Texas. Like, isn't that thing going to be like an oven on the inside if it's made of steel?
Well, that's where insulation comes in. It is in there, but it has to be hidden behind more steel. So if you call it an all steel house, it's, you know, you have to have some sleight of hand with any project, and you can pretend that it's all steel, but it can't be, because then they would be roasted. You'd have roasted people in there. So yes, you do have to have the technical side, even if you're building a quote unquote sculpture, which is one of the things I love about architecture. As much as you want it to be art, you still got to make it practical, and you still got to make it livable. But yeah, as far as like the loudness or the brashness, I mean, if you go in a subway car in Paris, for instance, and people are kind of sitting there quietly, you know who the Americans are, because they're usually a little bit louder.
Yeah.
And, you know, that's what we see in some of the architecture here, you know, and it's not all across the spectrum like that, but there's a very kind of forceful element of that. And we're speaking for ourselves, and we're kind of setting our own agenda. And swashbuckling is a term, I guess, that you could say.
Yes.
But that's certainly what this.
Let's hoist the cantilever, matey.
Yes.
If a little bit is good, then more must be better, right?
Right.
Yeah, especially in Texas.
Now, Darren, when you were out there on the road, were there any white whales that you couldn't get to? Any buildings that you just couldn't access?
Pretty much all the ones I didn't photograph in the book.
Good answer.
Yeah, I mean, it is tough, especially with residential architecture. There's always this sort of debate that we have. You know, if a project is even visible at all from the street, do we just stay on the street and get a photo of it that we can then use for a project like that without having to go through the formalities of, you know, talking to the owner and going through all that? Or do we try to reach out to the owner and gain access to the property and to gain interior shots and things like that, but then also risk having the owner be upset at us for wanting to photograph it at all? So,
right.
You know, it's always a bit of a debate there about how to approach it. So anyway, yeah, for the public stuff, it's usually pretty straightforward, but the private residences can be a little tricky sometimes.
Sam, you said there's going to be a follow-up book to this. Tell me more about that.
That project will look a little bit more closely at where European modernism, specifically things like the Bauhaus or earlier efforts in Vienna and all over Europe, sort of start to merge with American architecture and what that creates. It's American architecture fusing a little bit more with the roots of European modernism versus sort of diverging. So obviously here in LA, where I am, got people like Richard Neutra, who very much continue the tradition of architecture that was being kind of very extremely modern for its time in Vienna, kind of extending over to there. And then you have that, you know, all across the country with people like Mies and Gropius taking over as deans at IIT and Harvard, and all the effects and where that sort of merges and where things become very, very mid-century modern and very minimal, but also, you know, there's also examples of very fanciful, like the new formalism of Edward Burrell Stone. There's a whole gamut within that range as well. And that's something that's important to see. There is no, whenever he talks about modernist architecture, there really is no modernist style. There's so many different styles. There's brutalism. We talked about organic architecture. There's, you know, the new formalism, which looks to the past. There's the international style, which is much more skeletal and also classically proportioned. There's Googie, which is looking to aerospace as its inspiration. There's just so many different types of modernism. So anybody who's trying to say this is modernist architecture, it's like, well, yeah, but what kind of modernist architecture?
Right. What flavor of ice cream are we talking about here? Yes.
Yeah, there's definitely, what is it, 48? How many is there's a lot of them. Endless. And
you can ask 5 different architecture critics and you'll get 7 different answers too, by the way. So
yeah, you're right. It's not codified anywhere,
not at all.
Really.
Not at all. Darren, are there some buildings that you just want to go back to over and over as a photographer that you just can't quite get enough of?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few places, for example, that whenever I happen to be in the area, I'll stop by, like the Marin County Civic Center, the Frank Lloyd Wright project there, which, I can't be on that freeway without stopping by and taking a quick walk around. There's the Goldstein Chiefs, obviously the Lautner that you mentioned is one that I'll jump whenever I have an invitation to go see it. I love spending time there. I mean, in addition to the Marin County, just about any Frank Lloyd Wright project, frankly, is something that I can never really get enough of. I know it's kind of cliche, or it's kind of embarrassing as an architecture fan to talk about Frank Lloyd Wright, because he's sort of the one architect that anybody, even a non-architecture fan, will know the name of. Been there, done that type thing. But honestly, whenever I'm in one of his spaces, I learn something new. It's almost a kind of a mystical experience to see them in person.
I've had that same reaction. My wife and I were on vacation in Maui, and we got lost, and we ended up at the Kamehameha Golf Club.
Oh, there you go.
Which was designed by Wright. And we go up and we drive past all the signs saying private members only, and go up to this guy who's out front and go, "Hey, we're architecture fans. Can we just walk around a little bit?" He goes, "Oh, yeah, we got you folks all the time." He was very nice.
Yeah, whenever I'm even if I'm not even aware that Frank Lloyd Wright designed a project, which is, it does still happen, believe it or not, but I figured out pretty quickly, because there's always something pretty special about his designs, and seeing them in person is pretty magical. So I would say pretty much anything that Frank Lloyd Wright did, or any of his acolytes, like Lautner, for example, always feel extra special to experience in person.
Now, Sam, as the author editor of this book, I do have a bone to pick with your publisher, is that your name is not on it, and it should be, because you are a real star in this segment. I mean, you're putting out more books these days even than Alan Hess, which is really saying something. Yeah. So please let them know that I formally protest your not being included on the cover.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And that's more the norm for their books, but I was a little surprised too. Maybe it's ironically they're a German publisher, so maybe it's more of that European understatedness. They don't want to They don't want to put it on. But it took some getting used to. Not used to doing that with any books that I've worked on. But just as important, I think, in any of these books is the names of the photographers. And I worked on this book. I was lucky. They said, "Who do you want to work with?" And so then I get to pick. Obviously, Darren and I have done a number of books together and been on the road and seen things, many things together. So he was obviously top of the list. And I think Darren, he's in the pantheon of all. You don't have modernist architecture without the photographers who have shot it, because people would know about it. I mean, most people don't get to visit all these places like we do. So he's a huge part of that pantheon. And I do have to shout out another photographer that was also on my list, Andrew Peelage, who shot a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
How far along is he on his mission to shoot every Wright building that's ever been built?
Yeah, he's getting there. I mean, he's well into the hundreds at this point, and it's kind of amazing. But I just have so much respect for him and for Darren, what they do. They just, and I've seen Darren work close up so much. I see the craft that goes into it. He'll get up at any hour. He'll go across, and he's tracking the sun at all hours, and the results speak for themselves. But it's not just static capturing an image; it's bringing you into the image, and it's really capturing the spirit. And both of those guys really know architecture just as much as they know photography. They know what about it is special, what about it you're going to like. And that's why, for Darren, that's why I love his shots so much. They're so alive. So I do consider Darren a big part of the pantheon of architecture photographers. He's single-handedly, in some respects, bringing a lot of modernist architecture that's been forgotten back to people, and a lot of things that people just drive right by and don't realize is so special. He's the reason that now we know it. So a tip of the cap for me. I'm not wearing a hat, actually. But,
Well, I think 50 years from now, there'll be a documentary on Darren. So we can all look forward to watching that together in our old age,
yes.
Right?
Yes, we have mystery, as we said. Yes, many layers.
I think that'd be a short documentary, but I appreciate it. And an honor to work with Sam on another project. When he sent that note, I was actually really excited because Honestly, we'd had a few other modernist guidebooks planned, and then COVID hit, and that all kind of went by the wayside. So having this project come along and having an opportunity to collaborate with Sam again was really exciting. Sam and I have a lot in common, and we kind of have similar, but also not completely identical views. So it's always fun to kind of debate and have discussions whenever we get together. And then also a word to the other photographers. I mean, it was just an honor to be included and to share the pages with, these other photographers that I also admire, and they've all done fantastic work.
Well, there have to be some sort of short film like the road movie of the two of you in the car driving across Texas with all the witty banter and decision-making about buildings built in. And then you stop at an In-N-Out Burger for lunch. That would be a great scene.
It would be something like The Odd Couple, but with architecture.
The book is American Icons, The Architecture of the United States, Visions and Defiance. Sam and Darren, thank you very much.
Thank you, George.
Thank you, George.
That was George with Sam Lubell and Darren Bradley. Carl De Silva is an award-winning architect and avid collector and researcher of Danish modern furniture. If there was ever a Jeopardy category called Danish Modern Furniture, Carl would win every time. He'd be rich. His new book, Lost Danish Treasure, tells the story of the discovery of a priceless watercolor of Finn Juel's Chieftain Chair. One of Denmark's top architects and designers, Juel was heralded by furniture collectors. This discovery is like finding the Q scrolls for Matthew and Mark, or a little more current, finding Amelia Earhart's diary after her crash. George and I spoke with Carl late last year via Zoom.
Carl, I don't really know what to make of this book. Is it a detective story? Is it an architecture book? Is it about furniture? I mean, what is it exactly?
Well, George, it's a little bit of all of the above. When I first set out to write it, I wasn't intending to write a book. It was more about just wanting to tell a story that I thought was important. And I was thinking more of just maybe an article. And then in order to tell the story properly, it started branching off and becoming a little bit of everything. So a little bit of detective novel, a little bit of a resource reference, and a little bit of a storytelling about a chair and a watercolor.
Well, there was a gang, right? There was like 4 of you that were working on this kind of thing, originally tracking the watercolor. Let's start with that.
Sure. It's more about tracking furniture. So I used to live in a 2-bedroom apartment, which had a pool table for the dining room table. So when I bought an old American 4-square house back in 2010, I was looking to furnish it with furniture, and I stumbled across Danish Modern. And I love the style, and it kind of ties in a little bit of my architecture background, where it was a perfect combination of architecture, engineering, technical design, but not on the Bauhaus side, which was more eschewing tradition. It really built upon the cabinet maker tradition in Denmark. So there wasn't much to learn about, so I ended up doing a lot of research to really find furniture. So it was really the basis for this research of finding furniture that laid the foundation for understanding what the watercolor was, that it was original concept artwork rather than a reproduction.
Okay. How did you discover Danish? Did you find Finn Juel first, or?
It was really just looking around for modernist wood furniture designs. I was very close to buying a set of made-to-order Vermont cabinet maker furniture, but I couldn't find any chairs that I liked that they offered. So just looking around online, I stumbled across a Danish chair, and I realized you couldn't buy it new. It was all vintage. And once I saw that one, the flood doors kind of opened up in terms of finding more stuff online.
So what was the significance of this watercolor, and why was it so important to find, and what clues did it give you about the chair?
The way I explain to a lot of people in the U.S. who may not be too familiar with Danish furniture, as an analogy, imagine the concept artwork for the Chevy Corvette somehow popping up in Denmark 70 years later and mislabeled. So that's how important the Chieftain chair is in Denmark. And not only was it a single watercolor, it was a watercolor that was a part of a set of 6. The other 5 watercolors are in the Design Museum Denmark in Copenhagen, which is kind of like a MoMA of Denmark.
Yes.
What was interesting is even though the other 5 are there, the curator and the executive director of the museum wasn't even aware there was a 6th watercolor, let alone that it was missing.
What did the watercolor depict?
It was picked the concept artwork for the chair itself, the Chieftain chair.
Okay.
So the Chieftain chair was designed in 1949. 2024 was the 75th anniversary of the chair, and it was arguably 1949 is the pinnacle of Danish modern furniture, and not just the year itself. This particular show, the analogy would be the Detroit Auto Show. So there was a show every year where the cabinet makers would work with architects to develop new furniture designs for that year. So this was a signature design. Finn Newell and Niels Vader, the cabinet maker, won first prize for the furniture, and this was the signature chair design of that year.
Finding this sixth watercolor, because it was so exceptional, did anybody else figure it out and want to buy it too?
Well, there were people bidding on it. So it was at an auction house in Chicago, and they had it listed. Finn Newell was correct. The Chieftain chair was correct, but they had actually listed as a Baker watercolor. So there's a famous story about Finn Newell doing watercolors for Baker. They had entered into an agreement in 1950 to do furniture in the U.S. This is right when Danish furniture was exploding in the U.S. And Edgar Kaufman Jr., who was a chief curator at MoMA at the time, actually brought Finn Newell over on a few design tours and wrote some articles about him on Interiors magazine. So there were a series of watercolors, and the famous story is that he submitted a few designs to Baker. They were black and white drawings, and they kind of were rejected for various reasons. He had someone in his office just watercolor the exact same designs and sent them back, and they were approved. So there's a good history of Finn Newell watercolors. So the auction house had said this was actually a Baker Chieftain chair watercolor instead of the original concept artwork.
I read the chat that you published from the moments leading up to purchasing this. You and your gang were online, I guess, all together looking at it, right?
Yes.
And kind of giving each other odds about how high it would go?
So we used to do it over email, and we used to have a lot of emails, so we ended up shifting to Slack. So it was almost a dedicated channel. And typically the Slack posts are various topics, but when this one popped up, it was probably the most amount of posts we'd ever had in that week leading up to the auction. And, this wasn't cheap, so we weren't exactly going to just bid without talking it fully through. But luckily, the auction house was in Chicago. I was able to go take a look at it firsthand and look for 2 or 3 different clues that verified that it wasn't a very early reproduction or another watercolor, that it was the original artwork. And I thought the chat was interesting, so I actually put it verbatim from the Slack channel into the book.
So tell us about the significance of the Chieftain chair, both in Europe and here in America, because it really is an important piece of iconic modernism.
Correct. So a good way to explain it is Finn Newell was not a typical furniture designer during his era, during the late 30s and early 40s. A lot of the furniture designers were architects, and their background was more in the Cor Klint school. Cor Klint was a Danish architect and started the furniture school at the Royal Academy. This was a very rational approach. A lot of the design came from a fundamental understanding of woodwork, of joinery. They used historical precedents such as Windsor chairs, Chinese chairs, and really distilled a lot of the ornamentation out of that. So the chair designs were very incremental, including the round chair, which is also by Hans Wegner, which was designed in 1949. It really is a distillation of a Chinese chair. Finn Newell came from a different perspective. He wanted to be an art historian growing up, and really made kind of a compromise with his father to go into architecture school, because architects had a better prospect at the time than art historians. His approach was more artistic, and so he would have designs that may not be feasible initially. So it was a very close relationship with the cabinet maker Niels Vader, which helped turn a concept artwork, in this case a Chieftain chair, which was a very flamboyant design at the time, even today a very flamboyant design, into something which was not only feasible from a construction perspective, but also from ergonomics, from a durability perspective as well.
Are Chieftain chairs still available for people to buy?
Yes, there's actually been 75 years of continuous production of the chair. The very first ones were very low volume. They're not exactly something which you buy in mass for either your homes or for offices. But in 2000, House of Finn Newell, that's a new brand that started about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, started slowly reintroducing Finn Newell furniture. And one of the first chairs that were reintroduced was a Chieftain chair. So they've been making it for about 20, 25 years now.
And where do you get them? Do you get them through a place like Design Within Reach, or do you have to order them right from the manufacturer?
Design Within Reach is one of their authorized dealers. They contract out with a number of different retailers around the world. Design Within Reach is probably the largest one in the U.S.
Now, it's not often, Carl, that we meet someone that's obsessed about such things like we are. Mm-hmm. This thing that you said started off, it was going to be an article. This is a book. I mean, this is 350 pages of story.
About a chair?
Yeah, about a chair.
Okay.
So he is into it.
Well, it is hard to explain it because the analogy I've used is The Devil in the White City. So that's another Eric
Oh.
Larson book about Chicago.
Yeah.
Right,
But I
right.
always caution people there's no mass murderers in this story. But instead, it takes the same idea. Instead of talking about the World's Fair, it talks about the history of Faneuil and Chieftain chair, not comprehensive because that would be even longer than 350 pages, but just enough to know kind of the background of Faneuil and where the chair came from. But then also the modern day, the four of us, the Gang of Four, which we never came up with a good name for ourselves. We just called ourselves a Slack Research Group. Because all four of us, we wanted to get Faneuil furniture. We did a lot of research, and ironically or coincidentally, the research to find the furniture really was a reason that we understood what the watercolor was. And a key part of that research was about 12, 13 years ago, the Design Museum Denmark, which has the other 5 watercolors, put out a book called Watercolors by Faneuil. So when Faneuil passed in 1989, his widow gave most of his professional archives to the museum. That included most of the watercolors that he's had in his private possession. They were just sitting in storage for a long time. With the grant, they were able to restore the watercolors, and they were able to print most of them in the book. So that book itself was a very good resource, and realize otherwise we would have no idea that this was the original artwork, let alone that there were 5 other watercolors out there from that same year.
Does the museum in Copenhagen want this one now? Have they made you some offers?
Well, they are aware. We actually got on the Teams call with them about 2 months. This is in the middle of the pandemic.
Yeah.
They were all remote, and they were undergoing a renovation. And I had a list of about 30 or 35 different points that was kind of the reasons we thought, the evidence that we thought this was the original watercolor. Once we got to 3 or 4, they stopped us and said, you know what, we believe you. It's the original Chieftain watercolor. We actually have a photograph from 1950 in the Charlottenburg Palace. Was a Faneuil exhibition that showed all 6 watercolors together, hung up for the last time before the Chieftain was separated. And that's kind of part of the story. Is there was a chair in that photograph from 1950 that is currently in the Art Institute of Chicago, so also down the road here from our offices. That chair, through our research, we found out that was the very first Chieftain chair that was ever made.
Oh, okay.
So the original watercolor and the first chair just happened to be in Chicago.
Now, there's no murder in this story, but there is a little bit of intrigue.
Mm-hmm.
So tell me about the Marcel Breuer Chieftain.
So that was a chair that was in the house. Marcel Breuer did a modular modern house design that was displayed in MoMA back in 1949. A couple of newlywed in Maryland saw the house and then contracted Breuer to design the house for them. They ended up buying a chair from George Jensen in New York, and that was one of the earliest chairs that came to the U.S. It was a lot of Danish furniture is done in teak.
Mm-hmm.
That was kind of an exotic wood that was used at the time, Cuban mahogany during the 30s and 40s. It shifted to teak once there was a trade agreement with Thailand. But they were well aware that the desired dark wood in America at the time was walnut. So a lot of the Danish furniture from the late 40s that was designed for the American market was actually made out of walnut. So there are a small number of chairs that went through George Jensen in New York that were made out of walnut. So it was kind of another clue. And then the details for those chairs helped organize almost like archaeology of understanding. There's no smoking gun that'll tell you this is number 1, this is number 3, but seeing how the details developed. And this is where the watercolor became very interesting to us. The watercolor was done before the first chair was ever made. So by seeing how the details progressed, you're able to slide certain chairs in a certain timeline.
So what were the kind of details that you saw in the watercolor that helped you authenticate it, if you can explain it to laymen?
Certainly. There are 2 parts, framing components that were not part of the watercolor, and there's also a very early yellow trace paper that the Design Museum Denmark also has. These 2 components, if they didn't modify them, the chair would have broken fairly quickly because they were putting loads on certain parts of the chair that were not durable. So the very early chairs, the very first 2 chairs, had a piece that you could see, almost envision, had to be added after the chair was initially assembled. So the only 2 chairs that have that details are in the Faneuil's house in Copenhagen right now, which everyone previously thought was the very first chair, and sitting in a storage room in the Art Institute. And that one actually came through George Jensen as well, through the George Jensen store, which one of Chicago's biggest patron of the arts, Muriel Kaus Steinberg Newman, purchased from George Jensen in 1950.
So, Carl, let's say that my grandmother's house, I go into her basement and I find this Chieftain chair. how much money have I got here? What are we talking about these things? How much are they worth these days?
Well, certain auctions have gone from anywhere, and if this is your grandmother's basement and she bought it back in the 50s,
Yeah.
then there's only two firms. One was Baker in the U.S., and we actually have a Baker chair from the 50s, chieftain chair, which only seen 3 or 4 of them pop up in the secondary markets. But the best version in terms of value would be the early Niels Vader cabinet maker ones. They go anywhere between 40 or 50,000 at auction. The highest ones went up for $500,000, but those are ones which are either Niels Vader's personal chair in rosewood, so not everyone went for that high amount.
Yeah.
So it depends. But if you found one and you made a post somewhere online, you would have many people come out of the woodwork contacting you to try to buy that from you.
So are you like the guy now when people have a question about the chieftain chair? Do they seek you out?
Oh, I would think so.
One of the 4, the Gang of 4, actually has a website called thechieftainchair.com. So until the book came out, a lot of information that we had all, the 4 of us kind of collated was posted there, and it's still kept up to date. So there really isn't a single person out there or a few people, because another analogy I would use is if you had a question about Impressionism or arts and crafts, there are well-established experts in the field. Mid-century modern and Danish modern, it's still developing, and that's one of the reasons why there was a big delta between what you could find on eBay, on auction houses, and what dealers would choose for them. There's no deals anymore for Eames chairs. In the last 15 years, I've seen 0 deals on Eames chairs because everyone knows about it. So I guess now a lot of the secrets are out, and part of the book is also talking about the people who knew the most previously, galleries, auction houses, didn't want to make that information public because that's their information is knowledge, and they're able to buy pieces for lower prices and sell for higher prices.
Well, this is really fascinating, Carl. The book is Lost Danish Treasure, Carl de Silva. The subtitle says, A lost masterpiece of Finn Newell has been found, and no one realized it was missing. A great book. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, George.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by June Goldfinger and Jeff Taylor, sponsors of Circle, Square, Triangle, a traveling exhibition on the architecture of Myron Goldfinger, and by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Malibu, Los Angeles, Toronto, and Palm Springs. Okay, Tom?
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 23,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4.3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl, with guest research by Bobby Morris. Bubbly is her middle name, or it could be Blanche. We're still trying to figure that one out. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with another well-read edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.